Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights here with Charlie Araujo. How are you today, Charlie?
Oh, I'm doing great. New York is having one of those like weird moments for me. And there are days like today where I barely leave the house. And so I glance outside and it's sunny and blue skies. And it's really easy to think it's like 75 degrees out there because, I'm from California. When it looks like this in California, it's 75 degrees, but
Sure.
it's really 30 degrees here. And I kind of convince myself or forget. So, it's good. It's nice and sunny. It's beautiful as long as I'm not
hmm
out there.
Yeah, it's just cold all over the country right now. It's strange. I think that's how winter works, but I'd kind of forgotten being here on the West Coast.
Well, speaking of winter, I think some of the AI companies are having a bit of an AI winter of sorts themselves right now. So we have some big news, of course, that everyone is talking about. And by the time this airs, which is just going to be, tomorrow, but we're at the risk of being beaten up over how much news. I think I read 7 articles today on
hmm
this topic, and of course, we're talking about DeepSeek. And I always know it's that we're crescendoing into this like amazing amount of hype. When I was on the phone with my father yesterday, and he's asking me about it, it's like, okay,
hmm
wow, this is like way up there. So, what is your? I mean, I guess maybe you want to set the stage for everybody in case they somehow don't know what DeepSeek is, and I'm curious on what your initial take is after reading everything.
Yes. So, in case you haven't heard, Chinese startup named DeepSeek launched DeepSeek version 3, which seems to be an LLM that is on par with what we've been seeing from ChatGPT, uh, the 4.0 model, except at 95% cheaper. Which is a big change. And it's open source, which means that you can also dig into it yourself, host it, and avoid a lot of the costs associated with typically using AI. And the kicker is that DeepSeek claims to have built this model for $6 million and avoided the use of the most advanced NVIDIA chips in the process since China is not allowed to buy those chips. So all of a sudden, if all of that is true, which I'm slightly skeptical about, this really turns the AI market on its head. At the very least, we can vouch for the fact that it is 95% cheaper and it is open source, so you can bring this model where you want, which in and of themselves is a big starting point for changing this market.
Well, sort of. I mean, it clearly has rattled the markets for a variety of reasons, but most significantly, I mean, two major factors and two major hits is there's all these billions, hundreds of billions of dollars being pumped into this sector, and if suddenly it can be upended as they are
Mhm.
claiming, then of course that calls all these massive investments into question. Like, has this just been wasted money? And then, of course, NVIDIA takes the hit because their big claim has been you need these big processors
Mhm.
or these big chips to be able to build something like this. And of course, just to call this into question. But you said the key word. And so I'd like to start there on your take on if this is true, because I don't even know if we can say that the first part of it. The only thing I think we can certainly say right at this very moment is that it is open source. They have, in
Mhm.
fact, released it. You can go and download it. And their benchmarks are self-reported, but because they are open sourcing, and I'm inclined to believe the benchmarks that they've in fact developed this model because people are going to test that, and if it isn't matching those benchmarks, we're going to hear that pretty quickly. What I am not nearly sure about is their claim that they did this so much cheaper and without any of these advanced chips. Some of
Mhm.
the reporting claims that China has tens of thousands of these chips, so it would not line up with we don't have them. Um, and more than anything, if that were, I mean, they purported to be a research based organization. They did open source it, and I applaud that. But if they really did it at such a lower cost, then why are they not telling us how they did that? Because that it upends everything that we know about how these models get built. And by the way, a 670 billion parameter model, I don't know how you do that without that sort of massive investment in resources. So I'm curious what your take. You said you're a little skeptical. I mean, what's your read on this?
Yeah. So although a part of me says there is definitely room to simplify the testing and development of AI models, um, yeah, it feels a little fishy at first glance. First of all, the $6 million cost, even if Chinese developers cost less than American developers, you still have to throw a ton of people at this problem to create the model. And you still have to do some level of compute. The Chinese developers at DeepSeek are saying that they have improved the testing and model development process by taking certain steps that are less, more deterministic, more rules based, more outcomes based, and being able to simplify some of the aspects of the model and some of the parameterization to avoid some of the costs associated with current AI modeling. And if that's true, I'm hoping they provide more detail on how that simplification has occurred, because I do admit that I do think it's not the best strategy right now for AI companies to simply throw as much compute as possible into the development of AI. So that would be a welcome step forward, and it would be good for the environmental issues that we're starting to be worried about with AI.
And
But
I'd argue it's an anticipated step forward, right? We are expecting that for all these reasons, that power consumption is too high, cost is too high, compute load is too high, all of those things. And so we've talked on this show about some of the research of people at academic institutions that are researching and testing different methods. And if a company came out and said we saw a 20% decrease in resource requirements, everyone would be going, wow, that's amazing, right? Because it's really hard. This is a very difficult problem to solve. And so for them to come and claim effectively a 95% reduction in those costs, it's astounding. It really borders on incredulity, is that the word? And I think we have to put in this other piece, right? It's a Chinese company. And so there's at least some folks out there that are publicly saying, hey, is this a psyops type thing as a way to undermine the AI market and to sort of undermine the lead that US based companies or Western based companies have. And I think if this was Mistral that came out with this, we'd be having a very different conversation. But because it's a Chinese company, because it is very clear that there's this sort of war, and we'll talk about Stargate here in a minute, this Cold War going on in the AI space at a geopolitical level. I think it really forces you to sort of put this all into context and cause you to question it. But I'd like to do a little thought experiment here around this. So let's just take all of these statements at face value for a moment. If it's all true, what does it do in your mind from a CIO perspective, from an enterprise perspective? What impact does that have?
I think it really speaks to the need to abstract the foundation models, because obviously the foundation model market is changing way too fast to honestly invest in any model or any vendor at this point. So you have to think a lot more about abstraction. I think this is great for companies like Perplexity, which have never aligned themselves to a single model, but to a service on top of the model. People were joking before. Some people have joked, "Oh, Perplexity is just a wrapper. There's no value to it." But increasingly, well-developed wrappers. Honestly, Salesforce is a wrapper on the Oracle database. Like, great apps are wrappers on service on foundational technologies, but it doesn't mean that they're not useful if they're designed well. So I think this puts the power more on the, call it, wrappers or apps associated.
Yeah, the AI application layer. What I think, my big takeaway on this, again, I think I am too very skeptical. Not that they've produced a great model. We always knew China would come up with a competing and a comparative model at some point. But the whole point of it being so inexpensive, that's where I'm skeptical of it. And I think we also have that's the number one app on the App Store, at least purportedly right now, and that immediately sent, like, I refuse to download it. That sends off all kind of warning signals about data being pumped into China, and who knows what the state actors do with that. So I think there's all these sort of concerns around it. But if it is true, to me, it is a shocking but fully predictable and anticipated race to the bottom. We always knew that, at least in my opinion, that LLMs were going to become commoditized. There are too many major players in this space, that they were going to find ways over time to reduce the cost, because we've seen this in every other technology industry, that the core infrastructure, which is what these LLMs are, becomes commoditized. It becomes this sort of foundational layer, and we just continually take cost out until it becomes the sort of baseline. Which is why I've always been, at the best middle of the road on NVIDIA over the long haul, because we know how the story ends. So to me, I look at this and say, all this is a very rapid and shocking acceleration of what we knew is going to happen anyway. And I actually, what some of the pundits have been saying, that it's a good thing, or that it should be viewed as a good thing, because it means exactly what you were talking about, that we can focus on building the application layer that in whatever form that actually starts delivering the real value, that the LLM itself isn't the value. So it'll be really curious to see. But I'm curious, your take though is, like the stock market hit and the sort of industry hit. It's been fascinating. My father, I told you, he asked me about it yesterday, and I sort of said much of what I just said a moment ago, that I wasn't all that overwhelmed by it. And waking up this morning and to the flood of articles and the flood of posts around it was almost a little shocking to me. And so I'm curious what your take is on the market reaction.
Yeah, so the intricacies of the market are a little bit beyond me, just because I haven't done my homework totally, but I feel like this is overreacting massively, because even if all this is true and they made the $6 million model, the fact is, when you put these models into production, you still have to worry about inferencing and the ongoing management of the model, and you're still going to have to throw hardware at that like crazy to scale a model. And when you look at NVIDIA's sales, they're basically sold out for the next 2 years from a production perspective anyways, and there's nothing that can change that. And we talked about last June, when we're looking at some of the academic improvements in research in AI, we were expecting an order of magnitude decrease in AI model development over the next couple of years anyways. Like, if us dunderheads can see it, surely the brain the brain boxes at Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs could have figured this out as well. The armies of people they have tracking NVIDIA, you're telling me they didn't know this? That's either ignorance, or or deliberately tanking the stock. I can't say which is which, but I can say that if we saw it coming, they should have seen it coming, and this is massively overreacting to what you think the future value of NVIDIA is.
Yeah, it's and I told my dad the same thing about this, that open source is great, but the reality is you still have to operate the dang thing. So it's a bit of a red herring, right? And the massive cost. If you look at OpenAI's cost, there's two big components to it, or Microsoft, even, right? There's model development, but it's the ongoing operation. And it's always been AI's challenge, the scale problem of AI. The inference costs are dramatic. So it will be interesting to see if they are claiming. Right now, they're only talking about development costs. Are they claiming that the inference costs are somehow cheaper? I haven't seen any performance efficiency gains on the inference level that they've reported. And that's really where the real bugaboo is with all of this. The second thing, and this, I didn't talk about this part with my dad, but the second thing is, if I think about this from an enterprise perspective, open source has always been a red herring in the enterprise world, because we as enterprise IT people don't want to try to manage all this stuff, right? Even if you're using open source, you contract with somebody who takes on all the headaches of dealing with that, because free isn't ever really free. And I think we have the exact same thing here. It's why Llama is out there as an open source model, and most enterprises are not deploying it. They're still going to Microsoft and the Azure approach, or OpenAI, or Anthropic, or AWS, because they need somebody to provide that extra layer. So I agree with you. I was almost bewildered and befuddled when I am seeing all of this response, and just everyone running around with their hair on fire, and it's like I couldn't quite get my head around it.
Yeah, that said, if you are worried about this, like from an operational perspective, I wouldn't worry about it so much. Like, there's so much more to NVIDIA than simply the chip. It's really about the ecosystem associated with developing models and bringing them to production. And if you've put your eggs in the NVIDIA basket, you might as well stay there. for now.
Yeah.
Like there's no huge change that should make you think, oh, suddenly all of this is useless.
Yeah, and if you're going to run out and go and deploy the API to the Chinese-based system, well, good luck on that one. So yeah, we'll see, But it does bring to light, and it was interesting to see I won't even say the juxtaposition, but the very fascinating overlap of timing. Because the other major news that we had last week was the fact that President Trump made a big to do about bringing a very interesting cohort of folks, I think. Sam Altman, Larry Ellison, and son from, I forgot his name.
Masa-san, yeah.
Thank you. From SoftBank to announce what they are calling Stargate, because of course we need to have some big futuristic name for this, announcing supposedly a $500 billion investment in data centers, claiming 100 billion quote unquote immediately, and then of course Elon Musk went up and said they only have 10 billion, and Altman says no, that's not true, and off it went. But it was interesting because the ostensible reason for this announcement was exactly what happened, right? Is to lay the groundwork to build the infrastructure, the massive infrastructure necessary so that that American AI companies could stay ahead of the Chinese. And then 2 days later, of course, we get the DeepSeek announcement, which is kind of ironic. So I definitely have my opinion on Stargate. What was your take on this announcement?
Yeah, first of all, there's the funny political back and forth of this, which is that when Trump announced Sam Altman, he literally announced him as I would say by far the leading expert based on technology, Sam Altman. And he's got Elon Musk, who just gave him $250 million politically. Off to the side, not at this AI announcement. So that's just kind of, interesting from a kind of a political fun watching perspective. But I think the more meaningful piece of this story is that when you're talking about OpenAI, OpenAI, it doesn't have $100 billion to put into this commitment, but they do have a lot of partners who are willing to put money into the game and skin into the game. So, for instance, when that commitment's made, people who weren't on stage included Satya Nadella of Microsoft. Microsoft has $40 billion included as part of this $500 billion investment. There's a lot of double counting and overlaps. And, if you count up all the commitments here, you probably have trillions of dollars of commitments just because, a lot of them are double and triple counted. But, that said, OpenAI definitely needs to raise a lot more money or get a lot more partners to totally fit its $100 billion commitment in here. And then I do find it interesting that Larry Ellison is brought up here as one of the key AI executives for America, given that a couple years ago we were wondering whether Oracle was really still in the game from a tech perspective. Not that their tech has completely changed in the past couple of years, but all of a sudden Oracle Cloud seems a much bigger player than it did.
Well, only in the eyes of President Trump, I guess. It was hilarious. But both of those, I mean, the shocking absence of Elon Musk, given that he does have XAI and clearly is a major player. And then on the other hand, you have Larry Ellison, and Oracle's obviously dabbling in their playing. They've got their foot in this race, I guess. But
and
clearly,
they might buy TikTok.
Oh yeah, okay, great. But we never talk about them as a major player when we're talking about the different AI models and all of those elements of it. So I thought, this stank of just political opportunism, and clearly Ellison has been a big Trump supporter, and so that was why, which again makes Elon Musk's absence even more baffling. So the whole thing was just bizarre. But brushing aside all the politics of it, what I found so disingenuous about this is that virtually all of this was already happening. This is just puffery around announcements and investments that people have already said. I mean, Satya Nadella was asked about it, and he says, well, I don't know. I mean, I have my 80 billion in because Microsoft has already pledged to put, depending on who you ask or how they count it, I guess, between 40 and $80 billion into building these data centers. So there's really, I don't know what this really meant, other than perhaps, Trump making a little bit of clearance for some of the energy regulations so that they can get power built, which is one of the big roadblocks for that. So that part is the only real meaningful part of it. But I guess to the broader investment world that maybe doesn't understand all of this or isn't following it like we do, they thought that this was like this big thing that we were doing, and I'm sure that was the intent. But yeah, I this one was like, I had me rolling my eyes because it was just, there's so little there on this one.
Well, there's no, yeah, it's all private money. It's not government money. It's not the government committing $500 billion to AI infrastructure by any means. Yeah. And so we're going to see a lot of this over the next few years. Trump is definitely good at doing press releases and bringing a lot of people up on stage.
I think the winner on this is actually Sam Altman. I mean, one of the things that I think we talked about, if we didn't talk about last week, I know that I had it in some of my stuff, but OpenAI has massively increased their spend on lobbying over the last year. He made a massive push of sort of befriending and being seen as a player with the all the incoming members of the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. And I think clearly this was a win, right? That he was on stage amongst, with notable competitors, or competitors notably missing out there. So I think that part was, this was the lobbying money paid off well. The big question will be, is it doing anything? And actually then the bigger question is, does this DeepSeek announcement, particularly to the degree that it's true, deflate this, right? Cause people then to go, well, why are we investing $500 billion if we only need $6 million to build a big giant ass model like that?
Right. But I would guess that these data centers are being treated as ongoing infrastructure, and who knows how long it will take to actually build these data centers. This could be a 5-year, 10-year commitment.
Oh yeah, exactly.
To get there. Yeah.
And as we talked about, the real issue is the inference anyway, and those inference costs are still necessary. So I think we're still going to need these data centers. I do think this may be an overinvestment, because I do think we're going to, whether it's through with what DeepSeek is doing or not, eventually we do know that we're going to see a compression in those costs and the compression in those efforts, including the inference, and that's just going to over time reduce the need for it. So we'll see how that plays out. But speaking of OpenAI, there was another big announcement this week. It was a busy week, I guess. And that is that OpenAI finally announced what they are calling Operator, which is, and I've actually forgotten Anthropic's version, but it is using your browser, right? So
apparently Cloud calls it computer use. That's why you can't remember it.
It's a horrible name. Yeah. So obviously in development too, it's in a preview, but it takes over your computer using your browser to do things. Operator does not do that. Operator opens up a virtual browser session. And Casey Newton, who I'm a big fan of, and his thing he actually ponied up to $200, didn't take a freebie, ponied up to $200, signed up himself so that he could actually test this out. And he found that virtual browser created lots of issues, because what that meant is that virtual browser was just a plain vanilla browser, had no context, had no sense of your logins or your preferences or anything. And that actually made it extremely hard for Operator to do even simple tasks, because it literally didn't know anything about what they're doing. This is something that is very near and dear to my heart, because we've been talking a lot about agentic AI. In fact, we'll talk about Microsoft in a second here. And the trick with agentic AI is context. If you lack context, agentic AI is, in my opinion, dangerous. And I think that's what this is, in my opinion, a fairly disappointing first run from OpenAI because of that. And I'm not minimizing it. It's a very thorny issue. It's a hard problem to solve, particularly at a consumer level. But the initial reviews that I've read, including the one by Casey Newton, basically point to, there is a whole lot of rough edges on this, that, things take longer to do, which is the opposite of the point of it. So I'm curious what your take was, if you had any experience, if you signed up for it or anything.
So I have played with it, and honestly, I couldn't get it to do much. So I think the challenge both with OpenAI Operator and Anthropic computer
Sure.
use. It provides an agentic way to work with keystrokes and mouse clicks, and that's fine. But the bigger challenge is you're trying to get a computer to think a little bit more like a person from a UX perspective, which is really not something that we have tried up to this point. And I think we're missing some sort of middleware layer for the agent to really figure out how to use something like a human. And frankly, some of these UX capabilities that we're supposed to appreciate as web browsers ourselves as human beings, aren't that great. And I think that's part of what these agents are showing, that what we actually do when we're using computers is often quite inefficient and based on 30, 40, 50-year-old paradigms rather than
Well,
something like.
yeah, it is. I mean, I think part of the challenge, we've talked about this a lot, that, one of the challenges with any form of technology is the very first modality is to simply replicate the way humans already do something and to then automate or digitize that process. And it should be followed by a second stage of transformation, which is the reimagining of that process to align to take most advantage of the technology. But what we see in many cases is that second stage never occurs. And so we end up with these very clunky interfaces and clunky processes because we simply did that first step and did only the incremental innovation or improvements after that. And so I think in part that's part of the issue. Now, if you remember, we talked a little bit about the CEO of Box, Aaron Levine, who had a post on LinkedIn talking about why computer use was so important. And for me, it was one of these light bulb moments of saying, oh, okay, I get that, because in a consumer type environment where I have the entire sort of known universe, it's extremely difficult, in fact, probably impractical, to build connectivity to everything in a digitized digital fashion. And so these sorts of solutions are attempting to close that gap. But as you pointed out, it's actually extremely hard to do because the system lacks that context, doesn't have that way of interacting on a digital intelligent sort of layer. And so therefore it's having to drop into our persona, which is like this horribly inefficient thing. And so it does cause, for me, it causes me to question. Well, it does two things. It tells me, as we're going to talk about here in a second with Microsoft, that the most powerful first steps around agentic AI are going to be in closed loop environments where we can control the interface, control the environment. And secondly, it does make me wonder, are we going to be able to get the sort of consumer where I don't have those controls, agentic solutions? Are they ever going to work? Or are they only going to work when we start reimagining how everything works to begin with?
Yeah, I think we'll eventually start figuring it out, but we need to have this additional stage where we are making it easier for agents and for generative AI to identify things like paragraphs on open text and open documents. Whatever logic is being used needs to become more efficient for that to happen, because that's what we do as human beings. When we read through a web page, we are effectively, among other things, doing, call it 50 to 100 different prompts into our brain and immediately getting results. Right now that takes a gallon of water and who knows how much electricity to do with an LLM, and it needs to be a little bit more effective than that to move forward. So hopefully
Yeah, well, I
get
do.
there. Yeah.
I do wonder. I think I agree with you that over the long haul we're going to figure it out. But it's why I get so frustrated when people talk about us being so close to AGI, right? Artificial General Intelligence, because my definition of artificial general intelligence, of AGI, is that the system can effectively perform these functions flawlessly because it is able to think just like we do, but do it at light speed. And that's the issue, is that the human brain is incredibly capable of intuiting, taking an interface that is never seen before and figuring it out, right? And clicking around and doing some trial and error and doing all these things that none of these systems can even come close to touching right now. And so I look at this and, people are saying, oh, we're within a year or two of AGI, and, maybe we're going to see exponential transformation here, but right now I look and go, no, we are so far from it.
Right.
Maybe in very narrow bounds we can get there, but
Mhm.
not at this broad where I can drop the AI into anything. So I think it will be interesting. I, as always, applaud all of these companies for being willing to put this stuff out there in very early stages and let people like us, hack it at it and criticize them when they're doing it's amazing technology. But clearly, Operator has a long way to go.
Mhm. Yeah, seems like we're more likely to be using, uh, you know, agents in more limited capacities and in closed boxes, and to be collecting called libraries or catalogs of agents, which brings me to the next announcement that we also noticed this in the past week. It's been a busy week for AI announcements, but we saw Microsoft release AutoGen version 0.4 this week, which really got your attention. I know, Charles. I'm curious what you saw there.
Well, as you know, and I think I'm finally be able to announce sort of the changes that are going on in my career and life here in a minute. But I've been very, very focused on agentic AI in the enterprise, and so this is an area I've been watching very carefully. And what I think there's two parts, right? So first, the evolution of thought around this entire space, which is part
Mhm.
of what AutoGen represents. And so I guess I'll start there, and then it speaks to Microsoft's strategy as well, which I think is also interesting from sort of an industry perspective. But AutoGen is basically an agentic AI framework. It competes with the likes of Langflow and Crew AI. And basically, if you're familiar with the underlying concepts of agentic AI, you have this process of an agentic orchestrator that takes the initial request and then hands it off, parses it, figures out, hands it off to other agents that are purpose built for a specific action or function to then go and do a search or take an action or do whatever they're doing, come back to the orchestrator and do it. But there's a handful of challenges with that. That sounds very simple in concept, but the orchestrator agent has to understand the tools that it has to work with and be able to do that, hand that off. And then it can be if it functions in a linear fashion, it can be very, very slow. So these reasoning systems we're always looking at how can we speed that up, either by taking concurrent action or by caching prompts and caching data or doing these different things. And so AutoGen 4.0.4 is a step towards improving that process and building out a framework model that allows whoever, developers, to start building on top of it. And so, that's what this is. And it sort of underpins or sits below the level of where like their Copilot Studio would be. This is very developer focused, and it's very much a building block framework. But it's interesting to play. So I have a take on what this means for Microsoft, but I'll pause there and kind of get your reaction to this entire space as it's developing.
Yeah, this is where agentic AI gets exciting for me, because the idea of being able to do multi-agent orchestration and being able to handle these handoffs more easily is where we actually get to create something that approximates logic. I am amused that this is being called an event-driven architecture. Simply because it brings so many bad memories back from a couple decades ago. But
All that is old is new again.
yes. But that said, thinking of events as the outcomes of agents rather than more specific transactional events, it's not a wrong label. It's just a one fraught with many flashbacks.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think I mean, there's lots of interesting gaps around it. The thing going back to the challenges that, for instance, we were just talking about with Operator, what this framework and frameworks like it, like I said, they're not the only ones that are playing in this space, right? The frameworks like this, what they do fundamentally is they allow you to create this contextual layer where you can now ingest a layer of metadata that allows you to understand the environment and to solve for the exact problems that operators having, right? I'm not using a browser and hoping I can figure it out. I'm creating those relationships at a digital level, so to speak, and I'm able to then handle and let the agents go and take action. So that's where I think it's interesting, and that's why I think we're going to see the first real efforts succeed in the enterprise space, because I can create this closed loop environment where I know the parameters on which I'm operating, and therefore I can control the action, and it's not just sort of the wild, wild west. What I think is interesting, the part from an industry perspective, is it is fascinating to me to see that Microsoft is sort of like at a craps table. And basically, because if you play craps, craps is one of these interesting gambling games where every single roll you can win, right? You can bet on anything. So you can bet on winning, bet on losing, bet on, crapping out, whatever. So any roll you can win if you have the bet placed the right way.
Right.
And so, there's this theory when it comes to craps, if you come and you bet the table that you'll come out ahead. And I sort of felt that's what Microsoft is doing. They're betting the table here, right? They have the entire Copilot lineup at the Office 365. So the high borderline consumer layer, right? What I call generic productivity. They have Copilot Studio, right? Which is an agentic framework or built around similar to what Agentforce is doing, allowing people in a much more drag and drop conversational kind of layer build somewhat simplistic agents. To get more robust agents, you need to have understanding of data architecture and data flow, but that's there. And then keep going down, they have now this, AutoGen, which is now an actual agentic framework, very developer focused, all the way down to their infrastructure level with Azure OpenAI, and now I think it's 100 different tuned models that they have for different things. So it's like this entire end-to-end stack. They've got something everywhere, and it's really, really interesting to see how they are playing. And I don't know if this is this idea that they can truly compete and win in all of these areas, or if they are just trying to bet across the board and see what sticks. But it is, I think they're unique in this way, that they are playing across so many dimensions of the AI stack. It is quite fascinating.
Yes, they are I would go as far to say they are the only vendor right now that is trying to control the entire AI stack from top to bottom. Nobody else is actually trying to take on all of it because it is incredibly immense, and it's difficult to succeed across everything from infrastructure to applications to data and AI orchestration. Like it's not easy, and there are going to be a lot of winners within each one of these spaces. But Microsoft wants to take them all on.
So you think they're going to win? You think they can compete across all these different levels?
No. The quick answer is no, but at least Microsoft will have an entire stack available for any CIO who wants to put all of their money into Microsoft and not have to deal with additional vendors.
I do think so. Unlike, say, like someone like Google, who has a history of abandoning stuff, Microsoft doesn't really do that, and so I think it makes those bets a little bit safer. But I do think, as a CIO, it does point to an interesting question, right? If you simply betting on the entire Microsoft end-to-end stack, probably puts you to a point where you're not getting best of breed, or at least eventually won't be getting best of
That's what I
breed.
mean. Like some of these will be really great services, and some of these will be like Microsoft Dynamics. It's like, it's a Me Too product, and you're buying it because of all the other stuff you can get along with it.
So that also, I think, leads to the question as CIOs, where do you make those investments? And it was interesting. Last sort of bit of industry news, I guess, is Gartner released, I think this is an annual study where they talk about IT spend. And the headline got my attention. The headline is that they forecast that IT spending to grow by 9.8% in 2025. On the one hand, not horribly surprising, but always good to see that IT spending is increasing. That means, for all the vendors out there, there's more money to go around. What I thought was interesting, there are two sort of interesting data points in it. The first was that there is that a lot of this is sort of, what would you call it, AI referential, meaning wasn't necessarily spending on AI directly, but it was spending on those things that were going to set the stage for AI. So it could be PCs or servers or other services with this idea towards future AI investments. So that was interesting. And then the second big thing was that this wasn't as much of a spending increase as it was a cost containment or a keeping up with increasing cost spend, which is, of course, less good news, and does speak to the fact that AI right now is mostly raising the cost across the board for everybody, which is why we're seeing these costs rise with the different vendors. So it was sort of interesting, and in the end, for me, kind of like non-news. But what did you get anything else out of it that you thought was interesting?
So I find these Gartner forecasts interesting more as a record of what has happened in the past year than what happened, what they're expecting. A couple of interesting trends is that if you look year over year, I actually looked at their January 2023, January 2024, and January 2025 numbers. And a couple of things that have happened are first, their predictions tend to be a little conservative. Growth has happened actually faster than they've predicted the last couple of years. So in 2022, they expected that 2023 growth would be 2%. It ended up being 3%. And then for 2024, they expected to be 6.8%, and it was actually 7.7%. And the big thing that they missed last year was the data center spend. Obviously, data center spend went through the roof last year, and Gartner completely missed it. They did not expect that was going to happen. And I think they are trying to play catch up and now say, well, if and try to predict that. But I think one of the challenges that Gartner has is with dynamic markets. They're not really good with understanding where that spend is going to happen next. I think they are underestimating again in the data center space. And I also find it interesting that they are expecting a big increase in software when I'm not sold on the agents and software making a huge difference in 2025. I know that Benioff wants to sell another $1 billion in and that's great, but am I convinced that there's going to be like $200 billion of AI spent next year
Yeah.
in the software space? Like it doesn't feel right.
Yeah, what I do think is interesting about it. So I actually do think we're going to see an uptick in software spend. I agree. I don't know if it's going to be quite that much, but we're definitely going to be seeing an uptick. I think the part that is interesting, I think the only issue that really is with Gartner is that they're trying to make this something where they think that that they want to make this prediction, right?
Mhm.
The reality is that none of us know exactly how this is going to play out or how fast it's going to play out, and it's extremely difficult to figure that out. And particularly when we're simply asking, executives, well, where are you going to spend your money? The reality is this stuff is coming out of left field, and everyone is trying to make their best guess. So all of that plays into it, and it's very challenging. So yeah, I think it's interesting. I guess we'll I love that you have the historical data, and I agree that it's probably underestimated. I think we're seeing the same thing. There's a lot of dedicated AI budgets that are probably not reflected in these numbers, and so we'll see. But it
Mhm.
also speaks to the fact that part of the challenge with this entire time and with AI is that there's an adaptation process that has to happen, right? We were talking a little bit about with the operator and earlier in the show that part of the challenge is that fundamentally adopting AI in particular is going to require some fundamental shifts in how we operate, how we interact.
Mhm.
And so I found it humorous story, a post in LinkedIn about this brilliant marketing about this guy that decided to try to replace a bunch of jobs with AI and the not so great results that he found.
Yes. So a guy named Henry Xu out there, who had previously founded his own $1 billion marketplace, wanted to figure out how much work you can actually do with AI. So he went out and he looked at 1,000 different gig jobs. He applied to all of them, and then he tried to solve them all with AI. And he found that AI was able to solve about 15% of those tasks in total. And he ended up making no money off of these 1,000 gig jobs because it costs money to apply to these jobs, but then you also have to get client acceptance for these jobs to get paid. And between all of that, he found that it just did not pay to use AI for these, call it Fiverr jobs and Mechanical Turk jobs and all these other temp jobs that are out there at this point. So, kind of a disappointment if you're expecting instant productivity and money from AI right now.
but not a disappointment if you're a gig worker, I guess. Your job is safe, at least for now. What I do think is interesting about it, I had two big takeaways from it. I mean, I found, like I said, brilliant marketing. I mean, I wish I could come up with these kinds of ideas to,
Mhm.
have been promoting different things I was working on. But two big takeaways. The first was that how many of these requests that people were posting jobs, that the posters seemed completely unaware that they could use AI to solve this, right? Rather than posting this job in the first place. He made a comment that in many cases, the job literally just took their job description and it was effectively a prompt that just could drop it straight into ChatGPT or one of the others, and it would generate a response. So that was like the first thing about and I think, it's easy to forget this, that's the vast majority of the people in the world still are completely unaware of what these tools can do, and even knowledge workers within enterprises, of how to actually leverage them effectively. So that was, I think, one. And then the second big thing is, you talked about there's a structural challenge, and we talked about this in the past about at the enterprise level, that to really adopt AI, you're going to have to drive some structural and cultural change within the organization. And the biggest reason he didn't get paid is exactly that, is that it was not built structurally. I think he used Upwork or Fiverr, whichever it was. It's not built structurally for this type of a workflow that is AI driven at its core. And so therefore it was very, as you were talking about earlier in the show, very inefficient from the perspective of doing that. And so those are two very interesting sort of takeaways from a sort of a fun story.
Yeah, I think that for better or for worse, we are still expecting at least some human oversight and interaction for the technologies that we are trying to use and the use cases that we are trying to support from an agentic perspective, even if it's something as simple as creating a logo or doing some sort of voiceover or some sort of thing like Notebook LM. Wow, how's she's she's very active.
I'm giving up all pretense now.
Yes. And on that note, we're going to call it a week. Thanks for joining us again. If you are tuning in, please like, subscribe, let us know what you thought and what we should be looking at for next week. Thanks a lot.